If I just click. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks everyone. This has been really interesting. I really enjoyed the day so far, and hopefully this brings together some of the themes that have already been introduced by Kent and by Kieran and by Hans, and I can see a few kind of interesting overlaps with some of the things I wanted to talk about. I thought I should mention quickly the fact that I was last week in Galaxy Soho that Hyun introduced us to, and I was there a few days last week, going back and forth, because interestingly, while it's it's a very high-end property, actually very high rents that have made it kind of prohibitive for a lot of businesses. In fact, most floors of that mall are basically empty. On the top floor there's a small cafe which is run by a former research informant, friends, collaborator, who was an environmental journalist in China, used to write freelance and for a number of kind of quite activisty environmental publications, and then really became a full-time activist, and set up a cafe for green NGOs, specifically to have meetings and what they call salons and so on, where they sort of bring together different speakers and people working on various campaigns. And he's up there on the top floor of one of the buildings in Galaxy Soho, running this in an otherwise largely empty building, actually thanks to a grant from Alibaba. Jack Ma, in fact, apparently is very keen on the idea of trying to promote environmental civil society. So they're sitting there, kind of largely alone there, but running a number of really interesting workshops and so on, one of which I was involved with a couple of weeks ago in Beijing. So it's just been slightly sort of surreal to see it come up in this context. But it also hopefully kind of introduced you to some of the sorts of things that interest me in terms of my academic work and sort of beyond. My background really is that I have a PhD in social anthropology, which was based in fieldwork with Chinese journalists in Beijing. But I've also worked for around 8 years now with an organisation called China Dialogue, which was, and I guess still is, the world's only fully bilingual website in Chinese and English on environment and climate change. It's based in London and Beijing. ChinaDialogue.net is really the place to read sort of high quality journalism and analysis and comment on all kinds of themes around environment and climate and sustainable development, from experts, journalists, concerned citizens, all kinds of people. And I now work, and actually really out of that kind of work, I published a book last year, which is an edited collection, really about the first sort of 10 years of the Chinese environmental movement. It's really the last decade of environmental initiatives coming from the grassroots in various forms. So it looks at NGO campaigns, at urban residents groups, at legal challenges, and various other kinds of activity. I now work full-time on a project at the University of Sussex. This project actually is joint between Lancaster, Sussex and SOAS. It's called Low Carbon Innovation in China, where I'm working more on agri-food systems and on solar energy. I'm not going to talk about that so much, but I thought I'd introduce that briefly, which we can always talk about. In terms of just this very big, general kinds of topic, I thought maybe there's 3 major points that I would introduce. One is really just to give a bit of an overview of the sort of very complex, interconnected environmental, social problems that face China's central government when it looks at the environmental challenge, and the kind of inextricable way that environmental problems are tied in with economic and social and political development and those kinds of deeper contradictions, so that we don't think of these as kind of natural environmental problems that can be addressed with technical means, but actually things that are very closely related to the sorts of economic and environmental and political and social changes that the other speakers have introduced. I then thought I'd try and introduce briefly the fact that China does have a great number of environmental laws, regulations, targets, policies, and that the issue here is not about a lack of those sorts of laws, but actually often for various reasons, but I'll start to introduce a difficulty in enforcing and in implementing these sorts of laws that exist. And I suppose it's a bit, in that sense, it's a bit of a counterpoint to what Hyun was introducing, in the sense that there is strong state power in China that does have a certain weight in in development decisions, but there are also limits, particularly to central government capacity to enforce its laws. And that often has a lot to do with central and local, of local states as well, which fits with a number of the things speakers talked about. And finally, I wanted to talk a bit about these sorts of social responses that are coming up, and the sort of need to engage with the sorts of public efforts that are coming up in response to the environmental crisis. This is a good example of what Hans was talking about in terms of the sorts of slogans one finds in the countryside. This is in rural Yunnan. It means participate in environmental protection work, support ecological civilization. Ecological civilization is quite a prominent slogan that was actually made a kind of buzzword of the new leadership. It's been around for around a decade actually, but it's become prominent recently. And I suppose what I'd like to talk about is sort of the sorts of complex worsening problems that underlie that buzzword, and the sorts of decisions and kind of interacting features that will that sit kind of below or beyond eco-civilization. This I suppose could be thought of as the sort of inheritance that Xi Jinping, the central government, is thinking about in terms of how to how in a context where we have Xi Jinping, arguably the most powerful leader since Deng Xiaoping, with presumably a very strong vision for what China should be under a kind of consolidated party rule, thinking to himself, okay, well, how do we deal with these kind of with Chinese environmental governance in a context of a kind of worsening crisis, which I think really is a meeting of economic, social, environmental crises. So we're coming to the end of the 12th five-year plan, which was from 2011 to 2015. I'll talk about it a little bit more, that contained various environmental and climate targets in a context where there's something emerging, which is increasingly being known in China as the new normal. That is to say, a type of slower growth and a need to rebalance the type of growth model that exists, and a transition to a new sort of growth. At the same time, we've got extensive pollution crises, a carbon-heavy energy mix, a very carbon-intensive, unclimate-friendly type of growth, and mounting health impacts and other kinds of impacts as a result, and a social crisis which is very tightly linked to the sorts of environmental crises that are occurring. And maybe another way of thinking about this is actually the sort of challenge this provides. My particular perspective, I guess, is that I'm coming at this worried about environment and climate and concerned about how these things relate. But maybe from China's leadership's perspective, there are other worries too that relate to this sort of challenged legitimacy of the party, managing an economic transition, maintaining energy security, being seen to deal with corruption, addressing deep concerns about the environment as a way of demonstrating concern for the people. So, as a number of people mentioned, Ken really gave a good introduction to this as well. That that China's decades of very fast growth in reform have also come at a very high cost, and there's been a great number of very significant environmental externalities. This is an example of, in the form of air pollution. It's a particular problem. Last year, according to the Ministry of Environmental Protection in China, the air in 86 out of 113 key cities reach air quality standards. Last year, the city of Harbin was basically shut down in October thanks to a really heavy, prolonged smog event. We've had very recent smog in Beijing. I was there at just at the end of last week. There was a kind of at the end of a national holiday, the boilers and all the production started back up, and you also had agricultural burning going on in the surrounding fields, and suddenly the entire city wasn't quite at this level, but it's still very, very low visibility. Basically, actually, in some cases, approaching the top of the chart in the air quality index. And I'll return a bit more to air pollution towards the end of the talk about time. We have water pollution. In 2013, the Ministry of Environmental Protection report said that more than 30% of major rivers were polluted or seriously polluted. In last year also, a report by the Geological Survey of China said that 90% of China's groundwater was polluted. There's, of course, with water you've got a number of other factors coming together, chronically low supply, uneven distribution, the impact of industrialization, of urbanization that we've been discussing, the impact of this uncontrolled pollution, of further population growth, wastage, river basin degradation thanks to other kind of environmental factors, and increasingly climate change, which I'm going to come back to. China, quite famously has more than 20% of the world's population, only 6% of its fresh water. So a very low proportion of average per capita water resources. Less talked about, but really significant and continuing story, which is very expensive and difficult to deal with and have lasting effects on food safety, food security and health, is soil pollution. And the sort of gravity of that problem is indicated partly by the official secrecy of the data around soil pollution. There's been a particularly difficult topic to investigate. It's something that in my work with China Dialogue we've actually tried to put a lot of attention on over the years, and it's been extremely difficult to get even what should be really public, academically produced kind of data on soil. It's really been a consistently difficult thing to study. And this kind of accumulated burden of pollution on health is becoming a very great source of concern. We do read things like that, for example, around 12 million tons of grain are contaminated every year with heavy metals. Cadmium in rice has been linked to bone softening in a number of rural Chinese villages. So there's a number of these sorts of things that are becoming increasingly of concern. And then added to all of these sorts of perhaps more direct sorts of environmental problems that can perhaps be localized more directly. We have climate change. And China is very widely known to be the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide by volume. It accounts for some 30% of the carbon dioxide emitted in the world in a year. China's coal sector is actually the largest single source of anthropogenic carbon emissions. Probably what's less known actually is that now China's per capita CO2 emissions have increased to the point that they're really roughly on a level with Europe. So for a long time we were talking about China as being a very large emitter by volume, but still that there was a lot of space for Chinese people really to come into line on average with their European counterparts. But actually there's really been a kind of convergence in terms of the average Chinese person, although of course there's great inequality within China. The major reason, as I alluded to, is really that China's energy mix is still very dominated by coal. Most of the air pollution, of course, also comes from China's dependence on coal. And it's projected to grow further overall, although come down slightly as a percentage. And climate change is going to have highly uncertain effects in China. It's already exacerbating existing water scarcity, food security issues. There's a potential for quite severe water shortages, further deterioration of aquatic systems, flooding disasters, and so on. And these are all things that are actually being increasingly understood at a central level. There's a number of kind of quite serious reports on China's climate vulnerability. One of the things people know about less, I would have said, is that China's megadeltas are actually particularly vulnerable to climate change and sea level rise. China's economic model has largely been export oriented and has led to the growth of these megacities along the eastern seaboard, many of which are actually in low coastal elevation zones, which are particularly vulnerable to storm surges and the sorts of disasters that are likely to become more frequent in the context of a warming climate. And you actually have real threats as a result to critical infrastructure, to these heavily industrialized, low-lying zones. So these are the sorts of things perhaps that would be going through the minds of Chinese policymakers when they're in the sorts of responses that maybe underlie that rhetorical push for the ecological civilization. So under that, there has been a really ambitious raft of sort of top-down climate-focused targets, regulations, policies. The ones in the 12th five-year plan are quite significant in some ways. The plan includes, for example, significant investments in low-carbon energy technologies, policies to support so-called strategic emerging industries, which include electric cars, energy conservation, and a nationwide target for reducing carbon intensity by 17%. Carbon intensity is the amount of carbon that's emitted per unit of GDP. So there's no overall reduction, but increasing kind of efficiency of growth. And the current debates in the run-up to Paris next year, when there's going to be a large UN climate conference, are really about how those targets will be fitted into an eventual peak, and when that peak will come, and whether China will set a peak year. And there's a debate now really about whether that peak will be basically 2030, 2025. How early can you bring that and still maintain some, these kinds of priorities that are in the 12th Five-Year Plan. And this fits with a kind of wider, longer, term legislative efforts. Since 1979, China's National People's Congress, the so-called kind of rubber stamp parliament, passed 280 pieces of legislation, of which 29 related to environment and energy. So it's a significant kind of sector of attention, as it were. The first being the Environmental Protection Law of 1979, which is very recently updated, and with actually some significant kind of stipulations, particularly involving trying to give more standing to NGOs that want to bring particular environmental cases. There's a water pollution law in 1984, there's air pollution law in 2000, environmental impact assessment law, and there's a number of other areas covered. And there's a large extent to which these in form are not badly crafted laws. There are some issues. I mean, a number of the laws are somewhat vague in the kinds of things they stipulate. They often encourage things rather than actually mandating them. For example, some of them are kind of closer to policy announcements than they are to enforceable laws. But nevertheless, China does have a kind of raft of environmental laws. It's also introduced, interestingly, a number of laws and regulations that actually specifically provide for public participation in environmental decision making. Now, in common with other environmental laws, the existence of those laws and regulations on the books is no guarantee of their effective implementation. But there are laws, for example, in 2008, actually very significantly, in 2008, China introduced an open government information law, which, if you read it, it's really identical to something like the Freedom of Information Act in the UK or the US, very, very similarly crafted, well-crafted law, very consistent with international norms. But in terms of actually the efforts of citizens to obtain information about sensitive environmental topics, such as hazardous waste disposal, the details of the environmental impact assessment process, these sorts of things, it's been it's been relatively unsuccessful. However, as I said, sort of one of the things I guess I wanted to get across was the extent to which, while these many laws and targets and so on exist, China's environmental governance is a much more complex, kind of an uneven environment compared to one might imagine. I guess also a little bit like Hans's example of the kind of inside and outside of these sorts of presentation as well. That the outwards trappings, for example, of a kind of authoritarian system with a high number of kind of strict targets and so on, might be belied by the kind of flexibility and difficulty that actually comes out when one starts to look at how environmental laws are created, are passed, and then are implemented down the system. The system under reform in China has sometimes been known as fragmented authoritarianism. There's been a number of different kinds of ways of describing this sort of form of governance. But this term I think is sort of interesting because it was used specifically, it has been used specifically to analyse the decision-making process that went into the creation of the Three Gorges Dam, of that massive hydroelectric dam, not so far from Hans's field site. And what was interesting when scholars looked at how the decision-making process was made to build this absolutely monstrous kind of mega project, it turns out, for one thing, that no one could point to a single moment when the decision was actually made to go ahead with the project. And this is really because the the kind of decision-making process was so protracted, it involved such a complex, fragmented system of layers of bureaucratic authority, you know, from a kind of a core group of leaders down to various institutions, you know, buffering between various different elite levels, bargaining between various kinds of parallel, fragmented, you know, vertically fragmented kind of units. No one could even really say when it was said that, you know, we'd go ahead and finally build this. And that's something that actually also has a real standing on the quality of the sort of legislation that's been passed. And when you look at for example, the compromises that have been made in the creation of a number of environmental laws, and you actually ask policymakers about why, for example, things are only sort of vaguely suggested as advice rather than, for example, mandated. It's often, you know, often people will quite openly say, well, this is really, you know, a result of the sort of compromise between the various interests that put together this law. So there's a high degree of fragmentation, even at that elite kind of bureaucratic level. And then there's another level of fragmentation, which really has to do with this gap between central and local that Hyun and various other people refer to as well, which is really about, you know, another level of kind of horizontal fragmentation that means, particularly at the local level, that there's been a high degree of collusion between polluters, between various kinds of special interests, and local government. And effectively, this has been one of the major reasons that environmental law is very difficult to implement at a local level. So I mean, in a sense, public participation and the emergence of sort of social concern around these things has often been thought of something that could be harnessed in order to better implement environmental laws at a local level, and it's something that Chinese policymakers, for example, talk about. But there's also been a kind of an uptick in a sort of I guess less managed form of social involvement in environmental problems. And, you know, we discussed a bit about the sorts of social conflict that's emerged as a result of land disputes and expropriation and so on. Interestingly, last year there was a Chinese official on the sidelines of one of the major kind of congresses of the Communist Party who made the statement that he thinks of the, I think it's supposed to be 180,000 mass incidents, so-called, so sort of protests and riots and so on that occur every year in China's cities and countryside. Pollution has now displaced land disputes as the leading cause of social unrest. So it's the major kind of catalyst for these many mass incidents. And his comment about it was, the major reason for mass incidents is the environment. Everyone cares about it now, and he carries on, this guy Chen Jinping, to say, well, if you want to build a plant and the plant may cause cancer, how can people remain calm? And this, really points to the sort of effects of rapid urbanization and of the creation of a system that, like you mentioned, where there's been quite a rapid change in the composition of cities, and really the introduction of a vastly new kind of constellation of social actors, and a circumstance in which, for example, middle-class residents now are able to have the security of buying a home, but aren't, for example, involved or don't really feel that they have any kind of stake in planning decisions, particularly around things like the siting of toxic or potentially toxic kind of plants and waste incineration facilities, petrochemical plants and so on. And a lot of the major kinds of disputes that have shaped what's been perceived as kind of environmental contention in China have really had at their heart kind of planning and geographical disputes around the zoning of various cities and the lack of a stake of an early stage kind of stake in planning decisions that people have had. And much like Hans mentioned with regard to smartphones, this effect has really been amplified in a kind of new media era where computing and messaging is pretty much ubiquitous. China has somewhat 600 million internet users, massive penetration of mobile internet, some 460, 500 million mobile internet users. Weibo, Sina Weibo, which was recently popular but has now kind of been eclipsed by WeChat, has some 500 million registered users. So really more than ever before, my background was in sort of in looking at the way that Chinese media landscape has changed, because I was very interested in the growth of environmental reporting. And through most of the history of the People's Republic, the Communist Party had a monopoly on information. Now more than ever before, news and opinions can be shared very, very readily among the public, and the environment has become a key issue of concern where people are sharing these sorts of information, and new media in particular has kind of given voices to really a generation of citizens who are, as I say, becoming economically enfranchised, but are frustrated by a lack of a kind of meaningful political stake in planning and these other decisions. So this is an example of a protest in Shufang in Sichuan province, where residents in 2012 were protesting against the construction of a copper refinery that they felt would pollute the city. And this photograph of this baton-wielding police officer chasing student demonstrators was circulated online, and something happened there, which is kind of a well-known, increasingly well-known Chinese internet phenomenon called the human flesh search, where people sort of searched up to try and work out who this character was, whether they could actually identify him. He was subsequently identified as a guy called Liu Bo, and he then was reimagined and kind of circulated online. So this is him chasing the much-loved Chinese hurdler Liu Xiang. This is him in the background of the screen. The kind of upshot of this, I think, is that this sort of spectre of urban discontent, amplified by the growth of new media, mobile computing, and these new sorts of forms of communication that are not controlled in kind of not able to be controlled in sort of traditional forms, I think looms very large for Chinese decision makers, and consumed as they are, but I think by its potential to derail economic development plans, and indeed the further kind of social unrest that would be feared if economic growth were to falter as a result. So you have this really quite complex kind of wicked problem coming up here, and over the last few years, this very significant kind of succession of protests opposing large industrial facilities and infrastructure, and policymakers really struggling to think about how to actually how to address this. I would suggest there's another more hopeful way that one could start thinking about the sorts of strategies that are coming up from the grassroots, from citizens in response to environmental pollution, and that there are ways to actually embrace these sorts of initiatives as something transformational and something that points to maybe a more kind of bottom-up vision of what ecological civilization could be in China. And one of those many moments was in late 2011 when this unusually polluted few weeks in Beijing was seeing airplanes grounded. You could barely see the tops of the tops of buildings because the air pollution becomes so thick. There became actually quite a prominent conflict over the fact that there was such a yawning gap between the public reporting of air pollution and actually the observable reality that people could see in these thick polluted days. And what was the data that was being collected by the government's Environmental Protection Bureau in Beijing, particularly was not taking into account these airborne concentrations of what's called PM2.5, the smallest concentration of particulate matter. That's the stuff that's really quite dangerous and lodges in the lungs and causes respiratory ailments. And one of the interesting things also was that the US Embassy on its Twitter account was giving hourly updates on PM2.5 as they were measuring it from the river they're building, which is quite a smart kind of little way to challenge, I guess, the official data set. And it allowed a number of analysts, including this guy, Stephen Q. Andrews, who was writing for China Dialogue at the time, to do a kind of analysis to challenge that official narrative of the severity of the pollution, which really led to this kind of online storm of citizen complaints on microblogs, on Weibo, and so on, calling for the release of real-time information about airborne concentrations of PM2.5. You have online polls. Actually, one of the biggest ones started by the property developer Pan Shuyi, who's behind Galaxy Soho, among other things. Seeing tens of thousands of people calling for the government to release more accurate measurements. What's interesting about this story is that those calls were heard. In January 2012, Beijing trialled the release of PM2.5 data, way ahead of what they'd been planning, and the government actually acknowledged, well, not only acknowledged, even sort of championed the role of public pressure in the campaign. Xinhua published an editorial saying it praised the stirring campaign and the satisfying response from policymakers that led to an increase in information disclosure. And quickly, actually, another 200 cities or so started to release this data automatically in real time, and that actually is now, I should have had a picture on it, but this is a screenshot of the kind of app now that you can also have on your phone alongside WeChat and everything else, giving you actually a very close and pretty accurate update on concentration levels of various pollutants, including PM2.5 in various cities across China. So there's a real significant kind of move helped by grassroots efforts, and interestingly, some really kind of innovative digital efforts. This is a sort of favourite story of mine. These guys are set up a group called Float Beijing, and what they're doing here is attaching tiny Bluetooth-enabled pollution sensors onto kites. Kites are traditionally flown in the capital in Beijing, sort of by hobbyists, and these ones blink kind of like stars in the sky, and made for this very arresting art piece. But what they were also doing is creating a kind of dynamic air pollution data set that was made freely available and was able to be used to challenge the official narrative on pollution. So a really interesting little kind of experiment, and I think pointing towards the sort of interesting innovations that might be a kind of emerging source of hope for these sort of environmental efforts that we make, that Chinese citizens are harnessing new ways of working with information, with data, in a new media context to address environmental woes. And I'll leave you with one of the most innovative campaigners who's been going for a long time, a guy called Ma Jun, who's a former investigative journalist for the South China Morning Post. He founded something called the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs in Beijing. He's also the author of a book called China's Water Crisis, which is also often talked about as the first major kind of environmental work in China. What he does actually is collect publicly available information that's been released under kind of government transparency laws and so on, to build maps of environmental data that citizens can look at to find the sources of pollution near them, that residents groups can use to challenge the transparency of the local authorities, and that businesses can use to better understand the environmental impacts of their supply chains. And indeed, a concern of mine that journalists can use as the basis for stories. So this points to the sort of environmental governance context in which these kind of innovations will occur, and to this key issue, which I think is whether the issue is water pollution or climate change. China does have environmental laws and regulations, and there is some political will at the centre, but without strong citizen oversight, public participation, these kind of social responses, the implementation is often thwarted at a local level, particularly by collusion between local officials and polluters. And these new efforts to navigate this, are really, I guess, starting to allow concerned citizens to protect themselves against the consequences of poor environmental decisions and express their own visions of ecological civilization. Thank you.